Hi, I'm Emily Carding. I wrote this great big tome, which you can't see because my background blurring thing's making it blurred. There we are. And I originally started to write this back 7 years ago. I started an MFA in staging Shakespeare, and I knew from the beginning that I wanted to weave my magical practice with my theatrical practice together. And throughout those 2 years of that MFA, where I got to do residentials at Shakespeare's Globe, and I got to do some other wonderful magical things, which I'll come to tell you about in a moment, I realized that my thesis at the end of that 2 years was going to be on the practical application of the esoteric wisdom of Shakespeare. And that was obviously very much aimed at actors and developing a training system for actors. And then I thought, how can I develop this actually as a system of training, not only for actors, but for magicians who perhaps might want to bring a bit of Shakespeare into their practice, or what can Shakespeare teach your modern magical practitioner? And what is inherent in Shakespeare's works, and why is it inherent in Shakespeare's works to make it this rich, raw material for us to draw upon? So within the book, you'll find chapters on the Hermetic content. So when Shakespeare brings planetary influences and elemental influences into his plays, how that affects the characters, how the characters describe themselves as being born under certain planets or influenced by certain elements, and how that informs our understanding of the plays and of the characters. And you'll also hear about how Shakespeare is influenced by all of the Renaissance philosophy, the occult philosophy of the time, including the Kabbalistic philosophy and teachings that were coming in from the Jews that had been exiled and then Christianized in Shakespeare's society, how that makes its way into his work, the presence of alchemy through the work, and the alchemical process, how that's reflected in the plays. And I will be reading you a bit of that section in a moment. And then it also looks at much more overtly magical presences in the plays, such as ghosts and fairies and witches, but it looks deeper into those, looks at the different types of ghosts and what that means, fairies and how he influenced the pop culture version of fairies that we now have, but where his fairies came from. And I also have something that I'd like to share with you. I think the things that I found most interesting in sharing are the things that I felt I learnt the most when I was writing it. And you have then chapters on oracles and omens and divinations, how they appear in the plays. Invocation, Shakespeare wrote very powerful invocations, and also plants, and herbs, and trees. It looks at practitioners in modern theatre today who could also be seen as being magical practitioners who have a strong magical element to their work. And then it all builds throughout to a chapter at the end which guides you through creating your own piece of ritual theatre. And so thank you all so much for being here and for coming to listen to me talk at you, as I can't see your beautiful faces are hidden from me. So I don't know out there whether there is a mixture of mostly magical practitioners or people who are more in the pagan interest or the Hermetic interest or cultists, or whether there are actors and theatre practitioners out there. But I think that this book, I certainly meant it to appeal to people from whatever your draw to that subject area is. I hope that it guides you through in a way that's gentle enough and eases you in, that if you're like more of a magical practitioner but you don't maybe know Shakespeare so well, It can guide you in gently into the Shakespeare with plenty of summaries of the plays and guidance as to where you can get more information online if you need it. And for those who are very much Shakespeare experts but curious about magic but not really sure what that means in the modern world, takes you through that gently as well and introduces you to the various techniques that you would need and how to build on those techniques to develop a magical practice which incorporates Shakespeare and the philosophies of his time. Now, whereas many people have written about a lot of the esoteric content in Shakespeare before, most notably Francis Yates, it's often been most particularly from a Rosicrucian angle and from a very Christian angle, and often people have had a very specific area that they are interested in finding in there, and that's what they've mined. And in some cases, they've dug quite deeply and are coming to conclusions themselves, which may or may not be necessarily definitely there, may possibly be, but these are mystery contents of the plays. What I've tried to do is not only take that, but also look at the whole area of, as much as possible, not only that Hermetic content, but showing you exactly why it's there, how it's there, and then how to apply that, not in a way that would be relevant to an early modern person, but in a postmodern way. And I think that's possibly what this book does that's very unique, is that it presents the knowledge to you from the early modern practice and the early modern philosophies, shows you how they're present, but then, because I like a little bit of chaos magic myself, amongst other things, I'm also a priestess of Hecate and many other things, but I very much enjoy being able to take something that is inherently magical, using that as raw material to create something new and to build on that. And so this book will take you through with exercises at the end of every chapter that build those skills you need, whether the skills you need are the magical skills or the theatrical skills. So, for example, the first chapter gives you that basic history of the world, and then into the second chapter on Hermetics, at the end of that, once you've covered the planets, the elements, the directions, and so on, and how they are shown in Shakespeare's plays and characters, you then get to apply that knowledge of Shakespeare's characters and the planets and the elements into a ritual which creates sacred space, which is the best way to start if you're going to start doing any magical work. Then the next one is building a theatrical but also a magical skill, which is strengthening your voice. Because there are many ways in which magic and theatre weave together over the centuries in practice and in training. And some of these skills, I think, are being lost, not only in modern magical practice, but also in modern theatrical practice, what with amplification, microphones, and so on. So I'm fond of going back to the roots of that, ritual theatre in ancient Greece, the importance of resonating, the voice vibrating certain words, because our voice is what carries our will and our intent out into the world. Now, actors, we have to use this skill obviously to reach our audience, and there's an awareness there that is an energy that we're carrying. It's not just a sound, but when as an actor we stand on that stage and we speak those words, we know that we're carrying the intent of our character. In magical work, our voice needs to carry the intent of our magical working. So the stronger our voice is and how that's connected to our true self, the stronger our magical practice will be. So there's an exercise there to help you with that. Then it goes on into more complex things inspired by the content of the play, including an exercise on redemption inspired by The Winter's Tale. Now, The Winter's Tale, for me, is one of Shakespeare's most magical plays, and I write about this obviously in here, but it's also one of his lesser known. So if I may read you an extract from the book related to The Winter's Tale, if I can now find it, with my various bits on my screen. It will give you a sense of my writing style, so you know whether that's something you're going to get on with or not. But it would also give you an idea of the sort of the content of the book. I've broken my own structure already. I'm already skipping over things. I'll go back to the 12th night in Alchemy in a minute. Doing The Winter's Tale now. There we go. I'm a rebel against my own self. So, for those of you who don't know The Winter's Tale, this is a brief summary in a very light-hearted style. So that people who are afraid of Shakespeare might not, maybe a little bit less afraid, I hope. So King Leontes of Sicilia suspects his pregnant wife, Hermione, of sleeping with his oldest friend, Polixenes, King of Bohemia. He tries to get the loyal Camillo to poison Polixenes, but Camillo warns him that Leontes has lost the plot, and they both flee to Bohemia. Leontes puts Hermione, who has just given birth to their daughter, on public trial, but when an oracle from Delphi reveals that she is true, Leontes totally flips, orders their newly born daughter banished, their young son Mamilius dies of grief, and Hermione collapses. Paulina, a woman of the court and friend to Hermione, who is afraid of no one, chides the king, telling him that Hermione has died. And he suddenly realizes that he's been an absolute ass and goes into mourning. Paulina's husband takes the child to the shore of Bohemia, naming her Perdita. He gets eaten by a bear, and she gets found by shepherds who take her in. Anyway, 16 years pass. Perdita falls for Polixenes' son Florizel. There's some larks with shepherds in Bohemia. Everyone works through a lot of issues. They all end up in Sicilia, and Paulina brings them all to a statue of Hermione, who she brings to life. Everything is almost perfect, but Mamilius is gone forever. So, in Shakespeare's source for the story of The Winter's Tale, which is Robert Greene's Pandosto, the queen dies after being accused of adultery, and the king kills himself from remorse when he realizes his error. So, the fantastical animation of Hermione's statue and the reconciliation of king and queen, once lessons are learned, is entirely Shakespeare's creation. We know, or at least strongly suspect, that Hermione must have only appeared dead at the time and has been kept in a secret location all these years by Paulina, especially since reference is made to the fact that she has aged, which Paulina explains away as so much more our carver's excellent, which lets go by some 16 years and makes her as she lived now. However, if we, or Leontes, do not awake our faith, as Paulina asks us to, the magic may not move our souls in the way it is intended. We must be active and willing participants in the process. This particular rite appears to be inspired by a passage from the Hermetic book of Asclepius, in which the ancient Egyptian practice of the ensoulment of statues is mentioned. This connection seems even stronger when we consider the name Hermione has resonance with the divine name Haimamene, a goddess of fate mentioned in the teachings of Asclepius. What we call Haimamene, Asclepius, is the necessity in all events, which are always bound to one another by links that form a chain. She is the maker of everything then, or else the supreme God, or the ordering of all things in heaven and earth, made steadfast by divine laws. That's from Asclepius. Whether or not Paulina wields genuine magical powers that might be considered beyond usual human ken is ambiguous, but her use of music to alter consciousness, her wisdom in keeping Leontes and Hermione separate until the correct time, and her sage counsel to Leontes throughout, shows that she understands the alchemical nature of transformation and how to harness it. The multi-layered mythological and magical nature of The Winter's Tale is undeniable. And then it goes into the alchemical journey of the play, and I'm going to skip backwards, and I'm doing the ADHD thing. Sorry, I'm not going to be very linear. But what I wanted to talk about with the Winter's Tale is not only that it has the alchemical process here, which takes you through calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the whole play presents Shakespeare's version of the myth of Persephone, which you might not necessarily pick up on when you first watch it, but when you're aware of that and you see it, you pick up on all kinds of little references that Shakespeare puts in there to show you what he's doing. And his audience in the early modern times would have been very familiar with the sources that he was familiar with, or at least some of them would have been. So the mysteries of Eleusis. Our magician figure Paulina plays a key role in another level of mystery within this play. She has no fear of standing up to Leontes and is a psychopomp in that she goes between the court and the outer world, seemingly wielding her own authority wherever she goes. She's a protectress of Hermione over many years. In the greater initiatory rite represented by this play, she stands for the goddess Hecate and her role within the Eleusinian mysteries, the ancient initiatory tradition of death and resurrection based upon the myth of Persephone. The Winter's Tale becomes a far less mysterious title when we realise that it's essentially a retelling of this myth, which tells how winter came to be, with Hermione as Demeter and Perdita, meaning lost in Latin, as Persephone. And if we doubted that, we have these quotes here from the play. O Proserpina, for the flowers now that frighted thou lest fall from Dis's wagon. And that is a quote where we're first introduced to Perdita, where she has taken the form of a spring goddess for the harvest celebrations of the shepherds that she's being raised by. She then gives out flowers in a almost Ophelia-like way, but without the madness there. Very aware of the symbolism of that. These are the same flowers that Persephone picked when she was taken by Hades. The parallels here, the grief of Hermione once the baby Perdita has been taken away, and then the restoration of Hermione when Perdita is returned to her in the end. But you also have another character in this play called Autolycus, who speaks to the audience and explains that he was littered under Mercury. And so most of us may be familiar with the role that Mercury plays in the mysteries of Eleusis, with the travelling back and forth between the underworld and this world as a psychopomp. That role is sometimes played by Mercury, sometimes by Hecate. And this was one of the most extraordinary revelations for me, and I was very fortunate to spend some time in Sicily studying the mysteries of this play with Peter Dawkins and Mark Rylance. Peter Dawkins was a spiritual advisor to Mark Rylance, who was the original artistic director of the Globe, and was also involved in some of the some advice over the architecture, because he was an architect as well, of the Globe as it stands now, the reconstructed Globe. And we spent a week working through the play and working through finding all of those mystery moments and playing through it on the land in Sicily, which was an incredibly moving experience. So for me, that remains a very special play. It was also the first bit of Shakespeare that I got to perform on the Globe stage as part of my MFA. I'm going to go back now to talk a little bit more about alchemy, because again, when I was writing this, I think it was alchemy that was one of the things that I knew the least about when I was writing it, but I knew that I had to, because I knew from just looking at them and reading close readings of the plays that it was obviously a rich vein, but I knew I needed to know more about the alchemical process to really find everything that was in there. And with alchemy being the science really of the time, that place where science and magic sort of meet, I knew that this would be It would be full of references that the early modern audience would get, and that this could be a really valuable thing. And so the more I learned about it, the more excited I got, because it's there. You don't have to reach for it. You don't have to go, well, if I take this and put that there and make it fit. You look at the comedies in particular, because when people think about magic and Shakespeare, initially they go, it's Night's Dreams, Fairies, Tempest, it's got a wizard in it. Macbeth's got them witches. Hamlet's got a ghost. You don't necessarily think about the comedies. And yet, the comedies, a lot of the stuff, I don't know how much you know about Shakespeare, or whether you're very familiar with the comedies or not, but there's the stuff in there that doesn't make sense. And it's become sort of one of those things that you're like, yeah, that's great, but there's this bit where there's a guy there's a snake, and then there's a lion, and it's in the forest of Arden. What the hell is going on? And then when you actually study alchemy and the symbolism of alchemy and the process of alchemy, and then go back to the plays, you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And so I thought I'd share some of that with you. I also ought to keep an eye on the time. Okay. So going back a little bit, this is an extract from chapter 4. Must be my favourite chapter, because the other bit was also from this. Much has been written by scholars and academics over the centuries of the alchemical nature of Shakespeare's plays. But how much of it is genuinely present and intentional, and how much is fairy gold that might turn to leaves under scrutiny? We've already seen the extensive references to the elements and planets. Well, you would have done if you'd read the book. So maybe buy the book and read it, and then you will have done. And we know that Shakespeare was aware of at least the basics of the alchemical process from his direct references to transmuting base substances to gold. However, since Shakespeare was not writing from a perspective of openly mocking alchemy, its process, or its practitioners, as his contemporary Ben Jonson was in The Alchemist, the unfavourable political atmosphere of the Jacobean period meant that great care was needed to keep certain aspects of magical content hidden. This leaves an amount open to subjective interpretation, of course, but this art is no less potent for it. After all, who is the true initiate of the process of any play? Is it the characters within, or the audience who experiences it? If the audience, then surely the effect is valid regardless of the original intent or the accuracy of the content in relation to ancient processes. From what we have looked at already, we know that Shakespeare was incorporating a mix of Hermetic and mythological content. So in order to decode what underlying alchemical structure there might be in the plays on a larger scale, that is, what is reflected in the play as a whole rather than in individual characters, we must break down the alchemical process into clear, simple steps and see if any of the plays or repeating themes within the plays reflect this. Now, when I was writing this and I'm doing research to alchemy, I'm like, what are the crucial steps of the process? I then realized that all the alchemists of the period sort of had their own approach, and those various different versions of the alchemical process with a different number of steps. And this is what I go on to say in a far more eloquent way when I actually wrote the thing. I'll read you what I wrote, shall I? I'll do that. Solve et coagula. Of course, the alchemical process is not so easy to simplify, and there are many different approaches and interpretations. The ultimate aim of esoteric alchemy, in line with Hermetic philosophy, is the perfection of self in parallel with the pursuit of the fabled philosopher's stone, which would enable any ill to be healed and any base metal to be transmuted to gold. The alchemical process is one of transformation, both inner and outer, involving a breaking down, purifying, and reassembling of the self substance in its purest form. Go on a bit. Four basic stages: nigredo, blackening, in which the earthly self is burnt and dissolved away; albedo, whitening, in which the lunar, feminine aspect of the soul is awakened; citrinitas, yellowing, in which the solar, masculine aspect of the soul is awakened; and rubedo, reddening, in which the male and female are joined as one to form the androgyny, and the golden child or philosopher's stone is born. And within each of those 4 processes are repeated cycles of breaking down and purification. So when I came to write this, I was looking at everything I'd done so far, and I was like, well, we're looking at Hermetics, and we're looking at the 7 planets. And so I decided to go for the approach which is shown in the Azoth of the Philosophers, which has 7 stages, which actually correspond to the 7 planets, and it's all neat. It's all very neat and tidy and lovely. So if we look at those 7 stages, we have calcination, which can be seen as represented also by Saturn, lead and fire. I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burned and purged away. Can't resist a sneaky bit of the ghost in Hamlet. Calcination is the first stage in the purification of a subject, whereby the gross and unnecessary matter is burned away, leaving only what is essential and true. This process relates to physical death, or seeming death, or more accurately a process by which the ego and false self that is built up by ego is purged. Symbols relating to this first stage in the nigredo or blackening process are skulls, black crows, ravens, bonfires, red lions fighting other creatures, a solar king figure burning, and yellow lions fighting green serpents. Lions and serpents of varying colours are significant recurring symbols, as are the solar king and the lunar queen. The latter represent the male and female polarity of the personality, or at its most basic level, thoughts and feelings, respectively. The red/yellow lion represents fiery sulphur, and the green serpent stands for unrefined mercury that must be purified. Following, so I'm going to have to go quickly through this now, but the next stage is a dissolution, in which the remains of the calcination process are dissolved in water or acid. So you've got symbols like swimming in water, dark dragons, demons and beasts guarding treasure and things like that. Then you have separation, in which the unnecessary substances that have been separated from the essential parts in the previous stages are discarded, and the parts which are to continue being purified are saved through a process of filtration. That's Mars. Should go back. Dissolution is Jupiter. I mean, it's all in the book. I can't cover it all. Separation, then we have conjunction. So conjunction brings together the purified components that have been retained from the overall process so far. Fermentation, 2-stage process towards elevating the newly rejoined components to their higher spiritual selves, which begins with purification. Distillation, the fermented matter is boiled and condensed and leaves a purer form. And coagulation, happily ever after, hooray. So it's the final stage is the creation of the philosopher's stone, represented by an androgynous youth emerging from a grave, or simply an egg-shaped stone. I'm going to go off on one a bit now. Androgynous youth. Shakespeare writes cross-dressing heroines more than anybody, and I could go on about cross-dressing heroines until the cows come home. One of the most well-known plays that has a cross-dressing heroine in is As You Like It, which also has one of the weirdest bits of, just one of the weirdest occurrences in any of Shakespeare's plays, which is when, I'll have to give you, I'm going to give you a whole, I've just been touring with this play over the summer. There's a bad brother called Oliver, and there's a nice brother who is like the love interest. And at the beginning of the play, we meet Oliver, and he's like, ugh, I'm really unpleasant, and you've got to go away and leave me alone. And anyway, he's awful to Orlando, the love interest, who's delightful and goes off into the forest. And we don't see him for ages. And then he suddenly reappears towards the end of the play, a completely different person, saying, I've been so transformed because my lovely brother, who I've been so horrible to, was nice to me, and I've seen the error of my ways. The thing that his lovely brother, Orlando, has done that is so nice is save him from a green and yellow snake that was threatening to kill him whilst he's resting under an old oak tree. And this is all described in great detail. So this snake is frightened off, and then this lion in a forest in England appears, and Orlando wrestles this lion, and the lion is described as being, starved, and is a lioness, and her udders are drawn dry. And he battles this lioness and rescues his brother. And honestly, you see this speech, and you're like, really? And were there also mushrooms there that you'd been eating at the time? Then when you look at the symbolism connected to the alchemical process of transformation, which is obviously a process that this character has been through off stage, it makes sense. And you realise that these are things that a lot of Shakespeare's audience would have picked up on as well. I think that half an hour is such a short amount of time, isn't it? I had a bunch of stuff about fairies and grimoires that I was going to say as well. That's probably going to have to wait for another talk. I was going to very quickly say that...
Emily, sorry to interrupt.
But no, Emily, stop talking.
No, keep talking, Emily.
Keep talking. Excellent, love that.
10 minutes, please do.
10 minutes.
Yep.
Wicked. So I'm going to just read you, which will stop me from going off on a massive tangent, possibly, about Oberon in particular, because there's a whole chapter on fairies. I don't have time to read you the whole chapter on fairies, but I was particularly interested to discover a source that hadn't been touched on by other authors on this subject before. So Oberon, or Oberion, Oberic, Elberic. Oberon first appears in the Old French romance of Juan de Bordeaux and is identical with Elberic, the dwarf king, of the German story of Otwit in the Helden book. Forgive my terrible pronunciations. The name Elberic, or as it appears in the Nibelungen, I don't speak, I'm so sorry, Nibelungen, Alberic was changed in passing into French, first into Oberic and then into Oberon, and then finally became Oberon. That's an extract from Thistleton Dyer. Should have practiced that before read it. So T.F. Thistleton Dyer explains in his exhaustive work, Folklore of Shakespeare, which was originally published in 1883. It could be that Shakespeare first encountered Oberon from these sources, or perhaps he first came across our fairy king through a brief mention in Spenser's work, which, as we've already noted, was immensely popular at the time. Another contemporary appearance of Oberon was in Robert Greene's The Scottish History of James IV, which may have been performed before Shakespeare wrote Midsummer Night's Dream. In the original German and French tales, he was described as being a dwarf or an elf that was beautiful yet diminutive in stature. Robert Greene's Oberon is an antic. So where does the powerful and regal figure we are now familiar with come from? Is he purely an invention of the author? A source that is rarely mentioned when one reads about Shakespeare's influences is the grimoires, practical manuals of ritual and natural magic, often added to over the ages with handwritten notes by practitioners. Natural magic includes the charting of correspondences, that is, the qualities of plants and objects within nature that resonate with certain planets, times of day, organs of the body, etc., and the nature of certain herbs, plants, and stones, and how to find and use them. Ritual magic involves often complex and precise procedures to summon spirits, to perform tasks, answer questions, or often to petition God, if dealing with a pagan pantheon, gods or goddesses directly. The majority of grimoires from Shakespeare's time are strongly based within the Christian tradition, often harkening back to Catholicism, which had a much stronger foundation in ritual practice, and often using phrases or psalms from the Bible. Amongst the different kinds of spirits that may be summoned through ritual magic, as demonstrated in the grimoires, are demons, angels, pagan gods, and of course, fairies, including kings and queens of fairy. Now, Oberon, or rather Oberion, I could say it twice, it's just different spellings. That doesn't make any sense when you're reading it out loud. Sorry about that. Appears in 3 grimoires that are currently in published form and available to the public. The Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, which is David Rankin, Avalonia Books, 2011, also known by its less catchy identifying number, Sloane Manuscript 3851, is thought to have been written around 1620 to 30 and gives details of a ritual to conjure Oberion in likeness of a beautiful man, like a soldier, personally in the air or in a glass. Confusingly, in the invocation itself, the command is made that he should appear in the air in the likeness of a boy of 7 years of age. Sloane manuscript 3824/3825, also known as the Book of Treasure Spirits, again David Rankin, Avalonia Books, conjures Oberion together with his queen Mikhob, which I'm not sure the pronunciation of, to command the 7 sisters Lilia, Rostilia, Phoca, Fola, Africa, Julia, and Vanula in order to aid in locating treasure. The connection of fairies to treasure in folklore is hinted at in Act 3, Scene 3 of The Winter's Tale. Back to The Winter's Tale, where the old shepherd finds the gold that was left with baby Perdita and exclaims, "This is fairy gold, boy, and will prove so." And the most impressive tome of this type to feature Oberion was published by Llewellyn in 2015 under the name The Book of Oberon, which, as authors Harms and Peterson point out in their introduction, is a far better title than Vulgar Manuscript. This extremely impressive collection, it's lovely, you should get it. This extremely impressive collection of magical workings and drawings was indeed found in the world-famous Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., as it hails from the time when Shakespeare was alive and working, more specifically around a decade before he wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream. In the introduction, the authors ask, how much knowledge of the folk traditions surrounding Oberion might Shakespeare have known? And come to the conclusion that any connection is unlikely, because his functions in the play are fertility and marital bliss against the wide range of capabilities listed in the Offices of Spirits. And they also note that Shakespeare's Oberon is a mature man rather than a small boy, which is the appearance requested of Oberon in the Conjuration, much like in the aforementioned grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, in fair form like a child of 3 years of age. However, if we look at the description of Oberion and his powers in the Offices of Spirits, we can see many similarities with the Oberon we know. Oberion is a king. He appeareth as a king with a crown on his head. He is under the government of the sun and moon. He teaches a man knowledge in physic, and he showeth the nature of stones, herbs, and trees, and of all metals. He is a great and mighty king, and he is king of the fairies. He causeth a man to be invisible. He demonstrates this knowledge of herb lore in Act 2, Scene 1, with a purple flower he sends Puck to find, to use against Titania. Fetch me that flower, the herb I showed thee once. The juice of it on sleeping eyelids laid will make man or woman madly dote upon the next live creature that it sees. He also has the power to make himself invisible, which, due to obvious limitations of the abilities of Elizabethan stagecraft, is simply indicated by him declaring himself invisible. So potentially we can theorize he would be able to share that knowledge with others if required. As to the variance in size, age, there seems to be as much an inconsistency within the grimoires as between them and Shakespeare, though the childlike appearance in the conjurations is in keeping with the German literary source material. Perhaps the conjurations specify that he appear as a child, so it's not too intimidating. As to whether the folklore, grimoire, or literary appearance was established first, it is unclear. And then I go on to look at, later on, come back to the grimoires as a source. When looking at the chapter on witches and referring to Sycorax, who is the witch we never meet, but she's talked about in The Tempest. And it's a name that nobody has ever been able to find a source for. Until now! But if you want to know what that source was, I think I just gave you like a major clue, but I was really delighted to find that discovery. Then you'll need to read my book. And I think that's probably that. I'm going to leave it there and open up to questions. Examples of various magical practices and beliefs throughout the plays, and in the book, I don't think there's any play that I miss. Take, for example, Titus Andronicus. That's obviously a tragedy that ends very stickily and badly for everyone. That we have, and now I'm going off the top of my head, but I do write about this in the book, that an example of failed and misunderstood attempt at invocation or as a prayer version of invocation, is when Titus instructs everybody to write prayers and then put them on arrows and shoot them up to the gods, as if that's somehow going to work. And then you're reminded of a line in Hamlet where Claudius says, words without thoughts never to heaven go. If the intent isn't there, you can't just write something on a piece of paper and then shoot it off and expect that to work. There's a wonderful sequence in Titus as well, where he's holding his daughter. She's just gone through an extraordinary trauma, and he goes through this cycling through all of the elements, which I don't have just on hand to read to you, but if we have time to take more questions. But yes, basically, a shorter answer, there are examples. In a comedy, the alchemical process is complete and normally ends with a marriage, and so the separated elements are brought back together again and unity is achieved. In the tragedies, the healing can only be achieved by the sacrifice of the tainted component, which has not managed to be purified, to the land, and then the land itself is renewed. So the comedies tend to be more of an individual process, and the tragedies tend to be about the land requiring the sacrifice in order to be completely healed. Yeah, I can't remember an aha moment. That doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't one, but I suppose because my path has sort of gone between theatre and magic, with extensive periods focused on mostly I initially trained in theatre, and at that point I was also uncovering my magical path. The two have always been parallel for me, so I've always been awake to that presence within the place. I was an actor for a while, then I had my child and I left acting, and then I was 11 years of writing and training in magical things, writing about magical things, creating my tarot decks and so on, and then bringing all of that time back to theatre, and specifically Shakespeare again. Because I'd had all that time immersed very much in the magical world, I could just see that it was there. I was like, oh, okay. And I also felt that because of the magical training that I'd had, I came back to acting as a better actor. So it wasn't so much one specific thing, as a process, a long organic process. But perhaps the thing that woke it all up together at the same time for me was when I saw a production of Macbeth as a kid, and I just felt that, that when you feel that inspiration like a fire that runs through you, and I was like, that's what I want to do. It wasn't easy because there wasn't drama at my school or anything like that, but yeah, the two have always been woven together in my life and in my mind. It comments on it, but the book is, because there's so much to cover, because I am looking at all of the plays, and I'm also looking at how you can apply these things and build your own practice, create invocations from piecing together bits. There's a lot in there that's practical, as well as the things from Shakespeare. The main comment on those, particularly those two plays, is the difference in perspective on magic and what that has to say about what we can maybe deduce from Shakespeare's beliefs. It's very difficult to know anything about Shakespeare as a person, and it's a dangerous territory to extrapolate anything about somebody's personal life, especially of that era, from their work. But if we look at those two plays, we can see these university-educated playwrights were writing about magic as folly. This was the old practice that should be left behind. It was dangerous, it was to be mocked, it was a foolish endeavour that could not end well. You look at Shakespeare's plays, and you can possibly directly, and I do compare Prospero, which many people think was written in defence of John Dee, Elizabeth I's alchemist and astrologer, rather, sorry. who was in disgrace at the time that Shakespeare was writing The Tempest. And it's possible that Faustus was written with this sort of figure in mind. The Alchemist is almost certainly written to mock John Dee, who was then a disgraced figure. So you can see that these university-educated playwrights have got they're taking the more humanist, rational approach to magic, and Shakespeare wants to hold on to the Jacobean approach. And Shakespeare's still holding on to the Elizabethan philosophies. Whenever he writes about magical figures, they are normally sympathetic. Prospero's deeply sympathetic. He sort of has to have him give up magic at the end and asks people to pray for him. But you can see the other magicians that he writes, Charamon and Paulina, even the witches themselves, got a bit of a bad rap. It's one of my pet hates when people blame all of Macbeth's evil doings on the witches and on Lady Macbeth. They're just there as embodiments of fate. They're saying what's going to happen. They didn't say, best get murdering then, mate. Anyway, so Shakespeare, throughout his plays, shows that all of these various magical elements that we're looking at, the planetary influences, the elemental influences, the gods, the fairies, and everything else, the ghosts, should be taken seriously and respected, whereas Ben Jonson and Marlowe were taking a very different attitude and either mocking it or showing it something very dangerous that needed to be left behind. But I don't go into an in-depth analysis of those plays because that's not what this book is about. There's just mentioned in context of Shakespeare's work. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the ending of Midsummer, if you pay attention, it's quite, or can be quite dark, depending on what the director does with it. Fate and will. In terms of fate, particularly, there doesn't seem to be much escaping it. But magic and will. Magic is the sort of the effect of the direction of will. In this case, it was the fairies' will, which has, given these characters very little choice over what would happen to them. And I think that I've got a lot to say about Midsummer Night's Dream and fairies and the popular version of fairies that sort of came from that. I feel like people sort of cherry-picked in the Victorian period, they took the descriptions of being small and being in an acorn cup and all of this, and they left this very dangerous part behind. But the dangerous part is there in Shakespeare, and that's a very good example of him showing that it's not this world, this magical world, and fairies are not to be messed with. That these are powerful beings, and in fact, in the case of Titania as well, derived from ancient gods, Titania being one of the names of Diana, showing that she was descended from the Titans. Oberon, as we've seen, a very powerful being from the grimoires and a fairy king. Puck, who I'd love to I could talk for hours about as well. Very much a figure from English folklore that didn't really appear that much in popular culture until Shakespeare. He's deep in all of this, but the specific question was about fate and will. That's a talk in itself, isn't it? But if you go against what oracles and divinations and portents and things tell you in Shakespeare's plays, it doesn't work out well for you. There's this sense that that fate is decreed and very much ever present, and if you go against what has been specifically laid out for you, or deny that it can be predicted, even you ignore that advice, it doesn't go well for you. I could give you various examples of that. Caesar ignoring beware the Ides of March. Leontes saying the oracle is false. all of these examples have, ended badly. And the three witches as embodiments of fate. Well, they weren't wrong about what happened. And the fact that Macbeth just doesn't really pay attention to why are they being so specific about this whole Birnam Wood thing? That seems pretty specific to me. Maybe they're being tricksy here. Falls into a trap. I feel like I've waffled on a little bit about that one, but there's probably a talk in itself. It's a wonderful question. Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. This was part of a sort of little side panel where I'm warning actors mostly about what happens when you start developing a magical practice and then bringing it into your acting practice, to be very careful not to curse your fellow cast members or any equipment that might be in the vicinity. Direct the energy downwards and ground it, and not perhaps through a pointed finger directly at, say, for example, a camcorder. So this specific example was when I just started my MFA, and this was after 11 years of being very much immersed in magical training and magical work. So excited to be back in theatre. And this is one of the first things we were doing was a mash-up exercise, and I'd taken parts from The Tempest and Faustus, actually, and brought those two elements together to create a story where Ariel was appearing at the end of The Tempest to drag Prospero off to hell for his crimes against the spirits of the land. And I was playing Ariel in this scenario when we were supposed to film it for this assignment. And I really got into it, and I was taking bits from Caliban, all of these curses from The Tempest, and bits from Faustus, bringing it all together and really focusing the energy. I was like, oh yes, powerful stuff, it's juicy. And the camera turned off. I was like, oh, or maybe the batteries have gone. And it wasn't the batteries were fine. I looked at it and couldn't quite figure out what was wrong. Took it to the tech department, and they were like, well, was this memory card? Oh no, it was a new memory card. It's a really good memory card. Okay, yeah, it's melted. I mean, not quite seen anything like this before. No, you can't even retrieve the stuff off the memory card. This memory card is completely screwed. We have no idea how this could possibly have happened. And I was like, okay. So don't try that at home, kids. From that point onwards, I became very conscious of where I was directing the energy and what that energy was. And so, yes, always very careful to make sure that there's powerful energy there to make it look like you're doing something very dangerous and have the feeling of that, but to not actually be shooting out. That's because, magic's real, kids. Play nice. Yeah, without crossing any boundaries in terms of what should be shared, so things that were experienced within a group that shouldn't be shared. But when Mark Rylance was the artistic director of the Globe, and I believe it's a practice that I believe he continues into any other projects where he's directing, and when we did our pilgrimages to Sicily and also Verona, he did similar work with us. He would do a ritual to make offerings to the spirits of place, in order that they wouldn't feed off of you as artists in that space. And it's also just showing respect to the place, to the history of the place, to the spirits of the place that you're working in. And as far as I know, because when last I was backstage at the Globe, it was still there. There was a cigar box still under the stage, which contained the remains of the offering that was given when he opened that space initially with the first company. And there is an exercise in the book which is my own version of an offering ceremony that you might want to try, to ask permission and to give grace, if you like, to the spirits of place wherever you're working. It's a very valuable practice, and it's also a nice bonding exercise for a cast. It connects you all energetically as well, and connects you to the place. Sacred space. Thank you for the acknowledgement of my terrible pun. I'm grateful to my editor Alicia for allowing me to keep that. I was like, this is the first exercise that you have in the book, but it comes at the end of a chapter where we've looked at how certain characters embody certain planetary and elemental energies. And so normally when you are creating sacred space, you will call on either you'll call on the 4 directions, or you might call on the 7 directions, as in this case, so above, below, and within, as well as north, south, east, and west, and the elemental qualities of those. So it's taking characters that either overtly state that they embody that planetary or elemental energy, or ones that you can just extrapolate from the knowledge that you have of that energy, that they definitely embody that energy, and then calling on them. So it's a sort of a baby step into invoking characters to embody different qualities that might be helpful to you in your life, but it's also a really good first step if you're starting off in a magical practice to learn how to create a space that will keep good energies in, bad energies out. So calling in these different characters, I think that's the first point where I cross over from, okay, this was the early modern magic. Now here is some postmodern stuff. We're going to take these characters that Shakespeare has given us that embody these qualities and call on them and call them in, because they have been performed over hundreds and hundreds of years by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of actors, and have an energy, like a thought form type energy of their own. These are forces that when as an actor you step on the stage and you embody these roles, you can really feel flowing through you. Why not, as a magician, use that as a way into those energies, much like any kind of icon or sigil or something might be a way into a particular energy, if that makes sense. I think it was quite a different approach. I think that it's not been done before, so I hope people get something out of that. I think that the early modern and postmodern have more in common than early modern and modern, or modern and postmodern. Certainly in terms of theatre practice. So with the solo shows that I have done with Bright Theatre that I've toured with around the world, I play the main character and the audience play the other roles, and it's so interactive in a way that early modern theatre used to be, but it's a postmodern aesthetic. And I wanted to do the same thing with magic. Take the early modern occult philosophy, look at its presence in Shakespeare's works. Take Shakespeare, it's essentially a piece of pop culture work, but it's heaped with wisdom. Use that as raw material for postmodern magic, and give something that with the 12 chapters, which could be, if you chose to really make that into a practice, work through a month at a time, so it could be a year's span to work on each element of that. You can build a practice from these principles. It's going to be so lovely. I'm so excited about it. It's called Seeking Fairy. It's a little hardback gift book for the beautiful illustrations by Ciolo Thompson, who's a wonderful artist. And it's like little bite-size chunks. It's very accessible, but it was also full of exercises it will make and folklore. So it looks like a really pretty, lovely book about fairies that you might buy for, a family member or something, but it will actually also make you do work and show you some proper fairy knowledge throughout. Many exercises, meditations, practical applications, and so on, all illustrated by just these gorgeous pictures. I cannot wait for you to see. I think it's going to be so beautiful, and it will make a lovely gift for somebody, provided that they're happy to take on that part. It is like, it's one. I said the same about fairycraft, like my previous work, but with this even more so. It's like what I like to call a sugar-coated knowledge pill. It's very, very nice and very pretty, and then it's full of stuff. Thank you so much. It's been really fun.